Margaret Thompson adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and checked her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and she could feel sweat beginning to form under her carefully applied makeup. This wasn't how she had imagined her dream vacation to London would go. Standing beside her, her husband David shifted uncomfortably in his polo shirt and khaki shorts, the uniform of American tourists everywhere. Their two teenage children, Emma and Jake, were already looking bored despite having been in London for only 2 days. Margaret had planned this trip for months, saving money from her successful real estate career in Phoenix to give her family what she called a proper European experience. Margaret was the type of woman who was used to getting her way. Back home in Arizona, she was known for her persistence in closing deals, her ability to talk her way out of traffic tickets, and her talent for getting restaurant managers to comp her meals when she found the slightest fault with her order. She had built her entire identity around being someone who didn't take no for an answer, someone who could make things happen through sheer force of personality. The crowd around them was thick with tourists from all over the world. Margaret could hear conversations in dozens of languages as people jostled for position to get the best view of the famous changing of the guard ceremony. She had read about this tradition online and knew it was something they simply had to see. After all, how could you visit London without witnessing one of its most famous attractions? What Margaret hadn't counted on was the sheer number of people who had the same idea. The area in front of Buckingham Palace was packed with tourists, all holding cameras and phones, all trying to capture the perfect shot of the ceremony. She found herself squeezed between a family of German tourists and a group of Japanese students, none of whom seemed inclined to give her the space she felt she deserved. Margaret had always been particular about her personal space. Back home, she drove a large SUV specifically because she liked the feeling of being above other cars on the road. Her house in Phoenix was in a gated community where she didn't have to deal with the inconvenience of neighbors being too close. The idea of being pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, many of whom seemed to have questionable hygiene habits, was already putting her on edge. David, who had been married to Margaret for 22 years, could sense his wife's growing irritation. He recognized the signs, the way she kept adjusting her purse strap, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way she had started breathing a little more heavily through her nose. He had learned over the years that when Margaret got into this mood, it was best to try to defuse the situation before it escalated. "Maybe we should try to find a better spot," David suggested quietly, hoping to redirect her energy before she decided to start confronting other tourists about their positioning. Margaret shot him a look that could have melted steel. "I'm not moving, David. I researched the best spots to watch this ceremony, and according to every website I read, this is exactly where we need to be. I'm not going to let these people ruin our vacation because they don't understand proper queue etiquette." The irony of an American complaining about queue etiquette was lost on Margaret, but not on several British tourists standing nearby, who exchanged amused glances. Margaret, however, was oblivious to their reaction. She was too focused on her growing frustration with the situation. Emma, their 17-year-old daughter, was busy taking selfies and seemed completely uninterested in the ceremony they were waiting to see. She had made it clear from the beginning of the trip that she would have preferred to spend her summer at home with her friends rather than traipsing around Europe looking at old stuff. Jake, their 15-year-old son, was absorbed in his phone, playing some game that involved a lot of tapping and occasional muttered exclamations. Margaret looked at her family and felt a familiar surge of disappointment. She had worked so hard to plan this perfect trip, to expose her children to culture and history, to create memories that would last a lifetime. Instead, her daughter was more interested in her Instagram followers than in experiencing one of the world's most famous traditions, and her son was completely checked out. This was supposed to be their big family vacation, the kind of trip they would talk about for years to come. Margaret had booked them into a 4-star hotel near Hyde Park, planned elaborate itineraries for each day, and even splurged on a guided tour of the Tower of London. She had envisioned the four of them bonding over shared experiences, taking amazing photos that would make all her friends back home jealous, and coming back with stories that would cement her reputation as someone who lived life to the fullest. The reality was turning out quite different. David seemed more interested in finding air-conditioned spaces than in embracing the adventure. Emma was constantly complaining about the walking, the weather, or the lack of familiar food options. Jake had already asked 3 times if they could go home early. And now, on what was supposed to be one of the highlights of their trip, Margaret found herself surrounded by crowds, sweating in the heat, and feeling increasingly frustrated with everyone and everything around her. As she stood there fuming, Margaret began to notice the other tourists more acutely. There was a woman to her left who kept speaking loudly in what sounded like French, gesticulating wildly as she told some story to her companions. Behind her, a man with a thick German accent was explaining the history of the ceremony to his children in a voice that was definitely too loud for the circumstances. To her right, a group of what appeared to be American college students were laughing and joking around in a way that Margaret found completely inappropriate for such a dignified occasion. Margaret had very specific ideas about how people should behave in public, especially when they were representing their countries as tourists. She believed in maintaining standards, in showing proper respect for important traditions, and in conducting oneself with dignity at all times. The casual, almost disrespectful attitude of the people around her was beginning to grate on her nerves. She checked her watch and realized they had already been standing in the crowd for over 30 minutes. The ceremony was supposed to start at 11 o'clock, and it was now nearly 10:45. Margaret was not someone who enjoyed waiting, especially not when she felt like she wasn't getting the experience she had paid for. Margaret pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of the palace, trying to find angles that didn't include too many other people. But everywhere she pointed her camera, there seemed to be someone else's head or arm in the way. She tried holding the phone above her head, but that just resulted in blurry shots that didn't capture the grandeur she was hoping for. The frustration was building to a breaking point. Margaret could feel her carefully planned vacation slipping away, moment by moment, compromised by crowds, by weather, by her family's lack of enthusiasm, and now by her inability to get the photos she wanted. She had promised herself that this trip would be different, that she would finally have the kind of sophisticated European vacation that her wealthier friends were always bragging about. Back in Phoenix, Margaret was used to being in control. In her real estate business, she was known for her ability to handle difficult clients, to negotiate tough deals, and to make things happen through persistence and determination. She had built her success on the principle that there was always a solution to every problem, always a way to get what you wanted if you were willing to work for it. But here in London, surrounded by thousands of other tourists, all with the same goal of seeing the famous ceremony, Margaret was discovering that her usual tactics weren't working. She couldn't negotiate with the crowd to give her more space. She couldn't charm her way into a better position. She couldn't demand to speak to a manager who would somehow magically solve her problems. The realization that she was just another tourist in a sea of tourists, with no special privileges or rights, was not sitting well with Margaret. She was used to being treated as someone important, someone whose time and comfort mattered. The idea that she would have to simply accept whatever experience she was given, without any ability to improve or customize it to her preferences, was completely foreign to her. As the minutes ticked by and the crowd continued to grow thicker around them, Margaret's mood darkened further. She began to fixate on how unfair the whole situation was. She had paid good money for this vacation, had done her research, had planned everything carefully, and yet she was being treated like just another face in the crowd. David could see that his wife was reaching the point where she might do something they would all regret. He had witnessed Margaret's confrontations with hotel clerks, restaurant servers, and airline staff over the years. He knew that when she felt like she wasn't getting the treatment she deserved, she was capable of making scenes that would embarrass their entire family. "Honey," he said quietly, "maybe we should just try to enjoy the experience. It's not about getting the perfect photos. It's about being here, seeing this amazing tradition with our own eyes." Margaret turned to look at her husband with an expression of disbelief. "David, I didn't spend $5,000 on this trip to just enjoy the experience. I came here to see things properly, to get good photos, to have the kind of vacation that's worth talking about. This," she gestured at the crowd around them, "is not what I paid for." The truth was that Margaret had very specific expectations about how her vacation should go, expectations that had been shaped by years of carefully curated social media posts from her friends and acquaintances. She had seen other people's photos from London, photos that showed them posed elegantly in front of famous landmarks, looking sophisticated and worldly. She had imagined herself taking similar photos, posting them online, and basking in the admiration and envy of her social circle back home. But the reality of tourism, with its crowds and limitations and unpredictable elements, was not matching up with the fantasy she had constructed in her mind. And as someone who had built her identity around being able to control outcomes and get what she wanted, this disconnect was becoming increasingly unbearable. The stage was set for something to go very wrong. Margaret Thompson, a woman accustomed to getting her way through determination and complaint, was about to encounter a situation where her usual tactics would not only fail to help her, but would spectacularly backfire in ways she could never have imagined. At exactly 11 o'clock, the sound of military music filled the air, and the crowd immediately began to surge forward. Margaret felt herself being pressed even closer to the people around her, and her irritation reached a new level. This was not the dignified, organized experience she had expected. This was chaos, and Margaret Thompson did not do well with chaos. The famous changing of the guard ceremony was beginning, and Margaret could see the distinctive red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats of the Queen's Guard emerging from the palace grounds. The tourists around her began raising their phones and cameras, creating a forest of devices that blocked her view even further. Margaret tried to push her way slightly forward, using her elbows to create space, but found herself immediately pushed back by the crowd. A woman next to her said something in what sounded like Italian and gave her a disapproving look. Margaret glared back, not caring that she couldn't understand what had been said. The tone was clear enough. "Excuse me," Margaret said loudly to the Italian woman. "I was here first, and I need to get some photos for my family." She gestured toward David and the kids as if their presence somehow gave her special rights to a better position. The Italian woman simply stared at her blankly and turned away, clearly not understanding English or choosing not to engage. This dismissal infuriated Margaret further. Back home, when she spoke, people listened. When she made reasonable requests, people accommodated her. Here, she was being treated like she didn't matter, and it was completely unacceptable. The guards were now marching in perfect formation, their movements precise and synchronized after years of training. The ceremony was a magnificent display of British military tradition, unchanged in its essential elements for centuries. The tourists were witnessing something that connected them directly to hundreds of years of history. Margaret, however, was not appreciating the historical significance of what she was seeing. She was too focused on her growing frustration with her inability to get clear photos. Every time she tried to take a picture, someone's head or phone would get in the way. She began moving more aggressively, trying to find gaps in the crowd, pushing past other tourists without excusing herself. "Mom," Emma said, sounding embarrassed, "you're being really rude. Just watch the ceremony." Margaret whirled around to face her daughter. "Don't you tell me how to behave, young lady. I'm trying to document this experience for our family, and these people are being completely inconsiderate. Someone needs to organize this better." Jake looked up from his phone long enough to roll his eyes at his mother's behavior. "Mom, it's just guys in funny hats walking around. Can we go find somewhere with Wi-Fi after this?" The complete lack of appreciation from her own family for the effort she was putting into this vacation pushed Margaret even further toward the edge. She had spent months planning this trip, had saved money and vacation time, had researched the best hotels and restaurants and activities, all so that her family could have an amazing experience. And now they were acting like she was the problem, like she was somehow being unreasonable in wanting to actually see and photograph the ceremony they had come to witness. The guards continued their march with military precision, their faces stoic and professional under their iconic bearskin hats. They had performed this ceremony countless times, in all kinds of weather, in front of crowds both large and small. They were trained to ignore distractions, to maintain their composure no matter what was happening around them. Margaret watched the guards and began to formulate a plan. She noticed that their route would take them relatively close to where she was standing. If she could just position herself correctly, if she could time it right, she might be able to get some really excellent photos. Photos that would show her friends back home that she had been close enough to see every detail, close enough to capture the ceremony in a way that would make her vacation posts truly impressive. She began calculating angles and distances, watching the guards' movements to predict exactly where they would be and when. Margaret had always been good at solving problems, at finding solutions that other people missed. This was just another challenge to overcome, another obstacle that could be conquered with the right strategy and enough determination. As the ceremony progressed, Margaret became more and more focused on her photography mission and less aware of the social boundaries that were supposed to govern her behavior. She began stepping slightly out of the designated tourist areas, moving closer to the barriers that separated the crowd from the ceremony route. David noticed what his wife was doing and felt a familiar sense of dread. "Margaret, maybe you should stay with the group. You're getting pretty close to where you're not supposed to be." "David, I'm not doing anything wrong," Margaret snapped back. "I'm just trying to get a decent photo. These barriers aren't clearly marked, and nobody told us exactly where we're supposed to stand. If they don't want people to move around, they should provide better guidance." This was classic Margaret logic. If the rules weren't explained to her satisfaction, if the boundaries weren't marked clearly enough for her liking, then she was justified in interpreting them however worked best for her purposes. It was the same reasoning she used when she parked in questionable spaces back home, or when she brought her own food into movie theaters, or when she used expired coupons by arguing that the expiration dates were just suggestions. The ceremony was reaching its climax, with the guards executing complex maneuvers that demonstrated both their individual skill and their ability to function as a coordinated unit. The crowd was fully engaged, watching in appreciative silence as the tradition unfolded before them. Margaret, however, was now completely focused on positioning herself for what she had decided would be the perfect shot. She had identified a spot that would give her an unobstructed view of the guards as they completed their march. The only problem was that this spot was clearly outside the designated tourist area, closer to the actual ceremony route than visitors were supposed to go. But Margaret had convinced herself that this was just poor crowd management rather than any intentional restriction. She reasoned that if the authorities really didn't want people to stand there, they would have put up more obvious barriers or stationed someone to direct the crowds. Since no one had specifically told her she couldn't stand there, she decided that she was within her rights to claim that position. She began making her way toward her target spot, stepping around and sometimes through groups of other tourists. When people gave her questioning looks or made sounds of protest, she simply ignored them or offered brief, insincere apologies that made it clear she had no intention of changing her behavior. "Excuse me, sorry, just need to get a quick photo," became her mantra as she pushed past increasingly annoyed tourists. She had learned over the years that if you acted confident and moved quickly enough, most people wouldn't challenge you directly. They might be annoyed, but they typically wouldn't make a scene. Margaret reached her chosen spot and immediately began taking photos, pleased with the much clearer view she now had of the ceremony. The guards were magnificent from this angle, and she was getting shots that were definitely going to impress everyone back home. This was exactly the kind of exclusive experience that would make her vacation posts stand out from the typical tourist photos her friends usually shared. For a few minutes, Margaret felt vindicated in her decision to be more aggressive about getting what she wanted. This was exactly why she had built her reputation as someone who didn't just accept whatever she was given, someone who made things happen through determination and persistence. While other tourists settled for mediocre photos from mediocre positions, she had taken control of the situation and created a better outcome for herself and her family. But Margaret's moment of triumph was about to be interrupted. Her new position, while offering better photos, had put her directly in the path that the guards would need to use as they concluded their ceremony. She was so focused on her photography and so pleased with her success in solving the problem that she hadn't considered what would happen when the guards needed to march through the area where she was now standing. The guards were approaching the final phase of their ceremony, a phase that required them to march in formation through the exact spot that Margaret had claimed for her photo opportunity. They maintained their steady pace and their stoic expressions, but they could see that their path was being blocked by a tourist who appeared to be completely oblivious to what was happening around her. Margaret was absorbed in taking photo after photo, trying to capture the perfect shot from every possible angle. She had her phone held high above her head. She was kneeling down to get different perspectives. She was moving around within her claimed space to find the best lighting. She was having the kind of photography session that she had always imagined when she pictured herself as a sophisticated world traveler. The other tourists were beginning to realize what was about to happen. They could see the guards approaching Margaret's position, and they could see that she was completely unaware of the situation she had created. Some of them began pointing and whispering, wondering if someone should warn her. Others seemed to be anticipating the inevitable confrontation with a mixture of curiosity and schadenfreude. David could see what was developing and felt his stomach drop. "Margaret," he called out urgently, "I think you need to move. The guards are coming your way." But Margaret was too caught up in her photography to pay attention to her husband's warning. She waved dismissively in his direction without even looking at him. "Just a few more shots, David. I'm getting some really amazing photos here." The guards continued their approach, their faces impassive, their pace unchanged. They had dealt with confused or intrusive tourists before, but usually a stern look or a quiet word was enough to resolve the situation. Margaret, however, was so focused on her photos that she wasn't even looking in their direction. As the guards came closer, the crowd began to fall silent. Even the tourists who didn't speak English could sense that something significant was about to happen. The atmosphere shifted from the casual excitement of sightseeing to the tense anticipation of witnessing a confrontation. Margaret finally noticed that the crowd had gotten quieter, and she looked up from her phone to see what was happening. That's when she saw them, 6 guards in full ceremonial dress, marching in perfect formation, heading directly toward her position. For a moment, she froze, unsure of what was expected of her. Then, in a decision that would haunt her for years to come, Margaret made the choice that would transform her from an anonymous tourist into an internet sensation. Instead of immediately moving out of the way, instead of apologizing for being in the wrong place, instead of showing any recognition that she might have made a mistake, Margaret stood her ground and raised her hand in what could only be described as a stop gesture. "Excuse me," she called out to the approaching guards, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet courtyard. "I just need one more minute to get some photos. Can you wait just a second?" The words hung in the air like a challenge to centuries of tradition, like a declaration of war against everything the ceremony represented. Margaret Thompson, real estate agent from Phoenix, Arizona, had just asked the Queen's Guard to pause their ancient ceremony so she could finish taking pictures. The silence that followed Margaret's request was deafening. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire courtyard seemed frozen in disbelief. Hundreds of tourists stood motionless, their phones and cameras forgotten, as they processed what they had just witnessed. Even the pigeons seemed to pause in their activities, as if nature itself was shocked by the audacity of what had just occurred. The guards, however, did not pause. They did not acknowledge Margaret's request. They did not even appear to have heard her. They simply continued their march with the same steady, mechanical precision that had characterized their movements throughout the ceremony. Their faces remained expressionless beneath their towering bearskin hats, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their boots hitting the ground in perfect synchronization. Margaret stood directly in their path, her hands still raised, expecting them to stop or at least acknowledge her presence. In her mind, she had made a reasonable request. She was a tourist who had paid money to be there. She was trying to capture memories of her vacation, and she only needed a few more seconds to get the shot she wanted. Surely these guards, who were essentially performers in a tourist attraction, would understand and accommodate such a simple request. But as the guards continued their approach without any sign of slowing down or changing direction, Margaret began to realize that something was going very wrong with her plan. The lead guard was now less than 10 feet away from her, and he showed no indication that he intended to stop or go around her. His expression remained completely neutral, as if she didn't exist. "Excuse me," Margaret said again, louder this time, with a note of irritation creeping into her voice. "I'm talking to you. I just need a moment to finish taking some pictures. This is supposed to be a tourist attraction, right? Can't you just wait a minute?" The crowd around her began to murmur, and Margaret could hear scattered gasps and exclamations in multiple languages. She could sense that people were reacting to the situation, but she couldn't understand why everyone seemed so shocked. From her perspective, she was simply trying to get the customer service she deserved as a paying tourist. David felt his face burning with embarrassment as he watched his wife's confrontation with the guards escalate. "Margaret," he called out desperately, "just move out of the way. They're not going to stop." But Margaret was now operating on pure stubbornness and entitlement. She had asked nicely, she had explained what she needed, and these guards were being completely unreasonable in their refusal to accommodate her simple request. Back home, when Margaret encountered unreasonable customer service, she escalated the situation until she got satisfaction. She asked to speak to managers. She left negative reviews. She made phone calls to corporate headquarters. She had never met a service provider who couldn't eventually be convinced to give her what she wanted. The lead guard was now only 5 feet away, and Margaret could see his face clearly beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. He was a young man, probably in his 20s, with the kind of rigid posture and blank expression that spoke of extensive military training. His uniform was immaculate, every button and piece of brass polished to perfection. He looked like the embodiment of British military tradition, someone who had dedicated his life to upholding standards and following protocols. Margaret, however, saw him differently. She saw him as a service provider who was being deliberately unhelpful, someone who was letting bureaucracy and inflexibility get in the way of providing a good experience for tourists. She had dealt with difficult employees before, and she knew that the key was to be persistent and to make it clear that you weren't going to be satisfied with poor service. "Look," Margaret said, her voice now carrying the tone she used when dealing with particularly stubborn real estate clients. "I understand you have a job to do, but I'm a tourist here, and I'm trying to get some photos of this ceremony. I've paid good money to be here, and I just need a few more seconds. Can't you just work with me here?" The guard continued his march without any change in expression or pace. He was now close enough that Margaret could have reached out and touched his uniform. But instead of moving out of his way, Margaret took a step to the side and held up her phone, apparently intending to take photos of him as he passed by. What Margaret failed to understand was that she was dealing with a member of the Queen's Guard, soldiers who were trained to perform their ceremonial duties with absolute precision and dedication. These weren't actors or tour guides or customer service representatives. They were active duty military personnel who took their responsibility to maintain the dignity and traditions of their regiment with deadly seriousness. The guards were trained to deal with various types of interference during ceremonies, from drunk tourists to protesters to confused individuals who wandered into restricted areas. Their protocols were clear and unwavering. They would not break character, they would not deviate from their prescribed routes or timing, and they would not allow civilians to disrupt their ceremonies under any circumstances. As the lead guard reached Margaret's position, he did exactly what his training had taught him to do. He continued marching in perfect formation, maintaining his route and his pace regardless of obstacles. If Margaret had been a stationary object, like a post or a barrier, he would have marched around it with minimal deviation. But since she was a person who was actively trying to interact with him and interfere with his duties, the protocol was different. Margaret suddenly found herself face to face with 6 feet of military discipline and centuries of British tradition. The guard's face remained completely expressionless as he continued his march, but Margaret could sense the steel-hard determination beneath his calm exterior. For the first time since the confrontation began, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. "Okay, fine," Margaret said, taking a step back but still holding her phone up to take photos. "I'll get out of your way, but I'm still going to take pictures. That's what tourists do, right?" But Margaret's idea of getting out of the way and the guard's definition were very different things. She moved slightly to one side, but remained within the ceremony route, continuing to take photos and still partially blocking the guard's path. From her perspective, she had compromised by moving at all. From the guard perspective, she was still interfering with their ceremony and needed to be completely clear of their route. The guard executed a sharp turn and continued his march, but Margaret, still focused on getting photos, stepped back into his path. She was so absorbed in trying to capture the perfect shot of the guards up close that she wasn't paying attention to where she was standing or how her movements were affecting their formation. "Ma'am, you need to move completely out of the ceremony area," came a firm voice from behind Margaret. She turned to see a police officer approaching, his expression serious but professional. The officer had been monitoring the ceremony and had noticed the developing situation. Margaret felt a surge of indignation. "Officer, I'm just trying to take some photos. I'm a tourist, and this is supposed to be a public ceremony. I have a right to be here and to take pictures." The police officer, whose name was Constable Williams and who had been dealing with difficult tourists for over 15 years, recognized the type immediately. Margaret was what he and his colleagues privately called a special tourist, someone who believed that their status as a visitor gave them special privileges and exemptions from normal rules and courtesies. "Ma'am," Constable Williams said patiently, "you're welcome to watch the ceremony and take photos from the designated viewing areas. However, you cannot interfere with the guard's movements or position yourself in the ceremony route. I need you to move back to the crowd area immediately." Margaret looked at the officer with the expression she used when dealing with particularly unreasonable service providers. "I don't understand why this is such a big deal. I'm not hurting anyone. I'm just taking pictures. These guards should be able to work around one person. Back home, when we have parades, the performers are much more flexible about working with the audience." The comparison between the changing of the guard ceremony and American parades demonstrated just how completely Margaret misunderstood what she was witnessing. This wasn't a parade or a tourist show that could be modified for the convenience of spectators. This was a military ceremony with deep historical significance, performed by active duty soldiers according to protocols that had been established over centuries. Constable Williams realized that he was dealing with someone who either couldn't or wouldn't understand the gravity of the situation. "Ma'am, this is not a negotiation. You need to move back to the designated area immediately, or I will have to escort you from the premises." The threat of being removed from the ceremony should have been enough to convince Margaret to comply, but instead it triggered her fight-or-flight response, and Margaret always chose fight. She had built her entire identity around being someone who didn't back down when confronted with unreasonable authority. "Are you seriously threatening to arrest me for taking pictures?" Margaret's voice was getting louder and more shrill. "I have rights here. I'm an American citizen, and I've paid to be here. You can't just throw me out for taking photographs." The crowd around them was now fully engaged in watching the drama unfold. Phones and cameras that had been pointed at the guards were now turned toward Margaret and the police officer. What had started as an attempt to get better photos was rapidly turning into a very different kind of spectacle. Emma, Margaret's daughter, was watching the confrontation with growing horror. "Mom, please just do what he says. Everyone is staring at us." But Margaret was now in full battle mode, operating on the principle that if you gave in to unreasonable demands from authority figures, they would just keep pushing you around. She had used this approach successfully in countless situations back home, from challenging traffic tickets to demanding refunds from airlines to getting her way with hotel managers. "No, Emma," Margaret said loudly enough for everyone around them to hear. "I'm not going to be bullied by some police officer who doesn't understand tourist rights. This is supposed to be a free country, and I should be able to take pictures of a public ceremony without being threatened with arrest." The guards, meanwhile, had completed their march and taken their positions, having worked around Margaret's interference with the kind of professional adaptability that comes from years of training. But the damage to the ceremony's dignity had been done, and now the focus of everyone present had shifted from the historical significance of the tradition to the spectacle of an American tourist arguing with British police. Constable Williams looked at Margaret with the weary expression of someone who dealt with this type of behavior regularly, but never got used to how exhausting it could be. He was now faced with a tourist who was refusing to comply with reasonable requests, who was disrupting a ceremonial event, and who was making increasingly dramatic claims about her rights and the alleged violations of those rights. Margaret had crossed the line from being a mere nuisance to becoming an actual problem that needed to be resolved. And as she continued to argue with the police officer, refusing to acknowledge that she had done anything wrong, she was about to discover that there were consequences for her behavior that her entitled worldview had never prepared her to handle. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and Margaret Thompson was completely oblivious to how badly things were going for her. In her mind, she was standing up for her rights as a tourist and refusing to be intimidated by overzealous security. She had no idea that her confrontation was being recorded by dozens of phones and cameras, or that her behavior was being witnessed by hundreds of people who would soon be sharing their own versions of the story across social media platforms around the world. Constable Williams had been trying to resolve the situation diplomatically, but Margaret's continued defiance was forcing him to escalate his response. He had given her multiple opportunities to comply voluntarily, had explained the situation clearly, and had been patient with her obvious misunderstanding of the protocol surrounding the ceremony. But Margaret's insistence on arguing and her refusal to move to the appropriate area meant that he now had no choice but to take more direct action. "Ma'am," Constable Williams said, his tone now carrying the authority of someone who was done with negotiation, "I am instructing you one final time to move to the designated viewing area. If you do not comply immediately, I will be placing you under arrest for disrupting a public ceremony and interfering with the duties of Her Majesty's Guard." The word arrest hit Margaret like a physical blow. In all her years of pushing boundaries and demanding special treatment, she had never actually been threatened with arrest. Traffic tickets, yes. Angry managers, certainly. Heated arguments with customer service representatives, absolutely. But the possibility of being handcuffed and taken away by police had never entered her calculations. For a moment, Margaret's confidence wavered. She looked around and seemed to notice for the first time that hundreds of people were staring at her, many of them holding up phones and cameras. The realization that she had become the center of attention in a very public way should have been a wake-up call. But instead it triggered Margaret's deepest fear, the fear of being seen as someone who could be pushed around. "You cannot arrest me for taking pictures," Margaret declared, her voice now shaking with a combination of anger and panic. "This is a public place, and I haven't done anything illegal. I demand to speak to your supervisor." The request to speak to a supervisor, Margaret's go-to move in any confrontational situation, was met with a response she hadn't expected. Constable Williams simply nodded and spoke into his radio, calling for backup and a supervisor to come to their location. Within moments, Margaret could see additional police officers making their way through the crowd toward them. David, who had been watching this disaster unfold with growing dread, finally decided he had to intervene before his wife completely destroyed their vacation and possibly got herself in serious legal trouble. "Margaret, please just apologize and move back with us. This isn't worth it." But Margaret interpreted her husband's plea as a betrayal rather than an attempt to help. "David, don't you dare side with them against me. I'm not going to apologize for doing nothing wrong. These people are being completely unreasonable, and someone needs to stand up to them." Emma was now crying from embarrassment, trying to hide behind her father, while Jake continued to stare at his phone screen, apparently trying to pretend that none of this was happening. The family vacation that Margaret had planned so carefully was turning into a nightmare that would haunt them for years to come. A sergeant arrived on the scene, a woman in her 40s with the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with every type of difficult situation imaginable. She quickly assessed what was happening and spoke briefly with Constable Williams, who filled her in on Margaret's behavior and her refusal to comply with instructions. "Mrs. Thompson," the sergeant said, having learned Margaret's name from her continued demands to be treated with proper respect, "I'm Sergeant Davies. I understand you're upset, but I need you to understand the seriousness of the situation. You've disrupted a ceremonial military event. You've refused multiple lawful orders to move to an appropriate area, and you're now interfering with police officers in the execution of their duties." Margaret looked at Sergeant Davies and saw another authority figure who was trying to intimidate her into backing down. "Sergeant, I'm a law-abiding citizen and a tourist in your country. I came here to see this ceremony, and I was simply trying to take some photographs when your officer started threatening me. I haven't done anything that justifies this kind of treatment." Sergeant Davies had dealt with thousands of tourists over her career, including many who had misunderstood rules or accidentally caused problems. The vast majority of these situations were resolved quickly with a polite explanation and a simple request to adjust their behavior. Margaret, however, was different. She wasn't confused or apologetic. She was belligerent and entitled, and she seemed genuinely convinced that she was the victim in this situation. "Ma'am, the changing of the guard is a formal military ceremony with specific protocols that must be followed for safety and security reasons. When you positioned yourself in the ceremony route and refused to move when asked, you interfered with those protocols. When you argued with the police officer who was trying to help you understand the situation, you escalated a minor issue into a serious problem." Margaret listened to Sergeant Davies' explanation with growing indignation. From her perspective, she was being lectured like a child for behavior that was perfectly reasonable. She had been trying to take photos at a tourist attraction, and instead of providing helpful guidance, the staff had been rude and threatening. "I don't accept that explanation," Margaret said firmly. "I paid money to come here, and I should be able to take photos without being harassed by police. If you don't want tourists in certain areas, you should mark them clearly and provide proper guidance instead of waiting until someone makes a mistake and then threatening them with arrest." The crowd around them was growing larger as word of the confrontation spread through the tourist area. People were abandoning their planned activities to come watch the drama unfold. Margaret had become the main attraction, though not in the way she had ever intended. Among the crowd were several British citizens who were becoming increasingly annoyed with Margaret's behavior and her disrespectful attitude toward their traditions and law enforcement. One elderly gentleman, a retired military officer who attended the ceremony regularly, spoke up from the crowd. "Madam, you're being completely unreasonable," he said in a crisp accent that carried the authority of someone who had spent decades in military service. "These young men are performing their duties with honor and dignity, and you've disrupted their ceremony with your selfish behavior. You should be ashamed of yourself." Margaret whirled around to face this new critic, her face red with anger and embarrassment. "And who are you to judge me? I'm a tourist, and I have rights. Just because I'm American doesn't mean you can treat me like a second-class citizen." The accusation of anti-American bias was the final straw for many in the crowd. Several people began shouting back at Margaret, defending their country's traditions and expressing their disgust with her behavior. What had started as a simple tourist mistake was now turning into an international incident, with Margaret at the center of a growing confrontation between herself and dozens of angry British citizens. Sergeant Davies realized that the situation was getting completely out of hand and that Margaret's continued presence was likely to incite more problems. She made the decision that Margaret had been unconsciously pushing her toward since the beginning of the confrontation. "Mrs. Thompson, I am placing you under arrest for disrupting a public ceremony, interfering with police officers in the execution of their duties, and causing a public disturbance. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." The words hit Margaret like a thunderbolt. She had been arrested, by foreign police in a foreign country for behavior that she still believed was completely justified. The reality of handcuffs and police stations and legal proceedings crashed down on her like a wave. "You can't arrest me," Margaret screamed, her voice carrying across the courtyard and reaching tourists who were hundreds of yards away. "I'm an American citizen. I want to call the embassy. This is illegal." But Constable Williams was already moving to take Margaret into custody, and her screamed protests were only making the situation worse. David rushed forward, trying to intervene before things got even more out of hand. "Please, officers, she didn't mean any harm. She's just confused about the rules. Can't we just apologize and leave?" Sergeant Davies looked at David with sympathy. She could see that he was a reasonable man who was embarrassed by his wife's behavior, and was trying to minimize the damage. But Margaret's actions had gone beyond the point where a simple apology could resolve things. "I'm sorry, sir, but your wife has been given multiple opportunities to resolve this situation voluntarily. Her continued refusal to comply with lawful orders and her disruptive behavior have left us with no choice but to arrest her. You and your children are welcome to accompany us to the station, where you can meet us there after we've processed her." Margaret was now in handcuffs, still screaming about her rights and demanding to speak to supervisors and embassy officials. The crowd was taking photos and videos of her arrest, and Margaret could see phones pointed at her from every direction. The realization that this humiliating moment was being recorded by dozens of people for possible broadcast around the world finally began to penetrate her anger. As she was led through the crowd toward the police vehicle, Margaret could hear the comments and reactions of the tourists she passed. Some were expressing sympathy for the police who had to deal with such difficult behavior. Others were making jokes about entitled Americans. A few were actually applauding her arrest. Emma was sobbing openly now, completely mortified by the scene her mother had created. Jake had finally looked up from his phone and was staring in shock at his mother being led away in handcuffs. David was frantically trying to figure out what to do next, how to handle the legal and logistical nightmare that Margaret's behavior had created. The family vacation that Margaret had planned so carefully, the sophisticated European experience that was supposed to elevate their social status back home, had turned into a public humiliation that would follow them for years. And all because Margaret Thompson couldn't accept that sometimes, as a tourist in a foreign country, you had to follow their rules rather than demanding that they accommodate your preferences. As the police car pulled away with Margaret in the back seat, still protesting her innocence and demanding justice, hundreds of tourists were already uploading their photos and videos of the incident to social media platforms around the world. Margaret Thompson, real estate agent from Phoenix, Arizona, was about to become famous in ways she had never imagined. The holding cell at the police station was nothing like Margaret Thompson had ever experienced in her comfortable suburban life in Phoenix. The walls were bare concrete, painted an institutional green, and the only furniture was a metal bench bolted to the wall. Margaret sat on that bench for 3 hours, alternating between rage at the injustice of her situation and growing panic about the consequences of her arrest. During those 3 hours, while Margaret stewed in her cell, the videos of her confrontation with the Queen's Guard were spreading across the internet like wildfire. The footage, taken from multiple angles by dozens of tourists, showed every moment of Margaret's escalating argument with the police officers. Her demands to speak to supervisors, her claims about her rights as an American tourist, her refusal to accept that she had done anything wrong. It was all captured in high definition and being shared millions of times. The story was picked up by news outlets within hours. Entitled "American Tourist Disrupts Royal Guard Ceremony," read the headlines on British news websites. Karen versus the Queen's Guard, tourist meltdown goes viral, proclaimed American social media accounts. The incident was being discussed on talk shows, analyzed by cultural commentators, and turned into memes by internet users who found Margaret's behavior simultaneously outrageous and hilarious. Back in Phoenix, Margaret's friends and colleagues were beginning to see the videos. Her real estate office was fielding calls from reporters wanting to interview Margaret's coworkers about her character and reputation. Her social media accounts were being flooded with comments from strangers around the world, most of them expressing their disgust with her behavior and their sympathy for the police officers who had to deal with her. Margaret's daughter Emma was experiencing her own nightmare. Her friends had seen the videos and were sending her messages mixing concern with barely concealed amusement at her mother's public meltdown. The sophisticated European vacation that was supposed to enhance Emma's social status had instead made her the daughter of that crazy American woman who tried to stop the Queen's Guard. David spent those 3 hours at the police station trying to navigate an unfamiliar legal system while dealing with his own embarrassment and anger. He had to arrange for legal representation for Margaret, figure out what charges she might be facing, and try to salvage what was left of their vacation. The stress was overwhelming, and he found himself questioning not just this trip, but his entire marriage to a woman who could create such chaos through her selfishness and entitlement. When Margaret was finally released on bail, she emerged from the holding cell expecting sympathy and support from her family. Instead, she was met with barely contained fury from David and tears from Emma. Jake wouldn't even look at her. "Margaret," David said quietly, his voice shaking with controlled anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand what this is going to cost us financially and personally?" Margaret, still operating under the delusion that she was the victim in this situation, immediately went on the defensive. "David, you should be supporting me right now, not attacking me. I was treated terribly by those police officers, and I'm the one who spent 3 hours in a jail cell for doing absolutely nothing wrong." The lawyer that David had hastily retained, a patient woman named Sarah Jenkins who specialized in helping tourists navigate the British legal system, tried to explain the seriousness of Margaret's situation. She was facing charges that could result in substantial fines and potentially even a brief prison sentence. More importantly, she would likely be banned from returning to the United Kingdom for several years. "Mrs. Thompson," the lawyer explained, "the charges against you are quite serious. Disrupting a ceremonial military event is not taken lightly here, especially when it involves the Queen's Guard. Your best option is to plead guilty, express genuine remorse for your actions, and hope that the magistrate will be lenient because you're a first-time offender." Margaret listened to this advice with growing indignation. "I'm not pleading guilty to anything because I didn't do anything wrong. These charges are ridiculous, and I want to fight them. Surely there are laws here about how tourists should be treated." Sarah Jenkins had dealt with difficult clients before, but Margaret's complete inability to understand the gravity of her situation was extraordinary. "Mrs. Thompson, I must strongly advise against fighting these charges. The evidence against you is overwhelming. There are dozens of videos showing your behavior. A trial would only result in more negative publicity and likely a harsher sentence." But Margaret was not someone who backed down from fights, even when she was clearly in the wrong. In her mind, accepting responsibility for her actions would be equivalent to admitting that all the people who had criticized her were right. Her entire identity was built around being someone who stood up for herself, someone who didn't let authority figures push her around. The family returned to their hotel that evening in complete silence. The luxury accommodations that Margaret had selected to impress her family now felt like a prison. The carefully planned itinerary for the rest of their trip was forgotten. Emma spent the evening in the hotel room crying and refusing to speak to her mother. Jake retreated into his phone and video games. David sat in the hotel bar, drinking and trying to figure out how to explain to his boss why he might need to extend his vacation to deal with his wife's legal problems. Margaret, meanwhile, was discovering the full extent of her internet fame. The hotel's Wi-Fi allowed her to see exactly what the world was saying about her behavior. The videos had been viewed millions of times. News articles about the incident were being published in multiple languages. Social media was full of discussions about entitled tourist behavior and cultural insensitivity. Reading the comments was a devastating experience for Margaret. She had never seen such universal criticism of her behavior. People were calling her names that she had never been called before. They were analyzing her actions and finding them completely inexcusable. They were making jokes about her appearance, her voice, her nationality, and her character. For the first time since the incident began, Margaret was forced to confront the possibility that she might actually have been in the wrong. The unanimous condemnation from people around the world, the legal trouble she was facing, the damage to her family's vacation, and her own reputation, it was all starting to penetrate her defensive mindset. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, which meant the family was stuck in London while Margaret's legal situation was resolved. David had to call his employer to explain why he would be missing additional work days. Emma and Jake spent their time in the hotel room, too embarrassed to go sightseeing and risk being recognized as the family from the viral videos. Margaret tried to convince her family to continue with their planned activities, arguing that they shouldn't let the situation ruin their entire vacation. But her children were mortified by the possibility of being seen in public with her, and David was too angry and stressed to pretend that things were normal. Mom, Emma finally exploded during one of Margaret's attempts to organize a family outing. Don't you understand what you've done? Everyone in the world thinks you're a horrible person. I can't go back to school after this. My friends have all seen the videos. You've ruined everything." The pain in her daughter's voice finally began to break through Margaret's defensive walls. For the first time, she started to consider that her actions might have consequences beyond her own legal troubles. Her family was suffering because of her behavior, and no amount of justification could change that fact. The court hearing itself was a sobering experience for Margaret. The magistrate, a stern woman who had clearly seen the videos of the incident, was not impressed with Margaret's initial attempts to justify her behavior. When Margaret began to explain that she had just been trying to take photos and had been treated unfairly by the police, the magistrate cut her off. "Mrs. Thompson, I have reviewed the evidence in this case extensively. The videos clearly show that you were given multiple opportunities to comply with reasonable requests from law enforcement officers. Your continued refusal to move to the appropriate area and your argumentative behavior with the police left them with no choice but to arrest you." Margaret's lawyer had convinced her to change her plea to guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. But Margaret was clearly struggling with admitting fault. When asked to confirm her guilty plea, she hesitated for long moments before finally saying the words that felt like they were being torn from her throat. "Yes, Your Honor. Guilty." The sentence was relatively lenient: a substantial fine, a ban from visiting royal properties for 5 years, and a requirement to write a formal letter of apology to the Queen's Guard Regiment. But for Margaret, who had never been in legal trouble before, even this light sentence felt devastating. The trip back to Phoenix was miserable for the entire family. Margaret tried repeatedly to restart conversations about their other experiences in London, to focus on the positive aspects of their vacation, but her family remained cold and distant. The viral videos of her arrest were still circulating, and Margaret knew that this humiliation would follow her home. Back in Phoenix, Margaret discovered that her real estate career was in jeopardy. Her brokerage was receiving calls from clients who had seen the videos and no longer wanted to work with her. Her colleagues were treating her with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement. The professional reputation she had spent years building was damaged, possibly permanently. Margaret's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitled tourist behavior in the age of social media. It was discussed in cultural studies classes as an example of American entitlement abroad. It was used by travel guides as an illustration of how not to behave when visiting foreign countries. Months later, as Margaret struggled to rebuild her reputation and her family relationships, she finally began to understand what she had lost through her behavior that day in London. It wasn't just about the legal consequences or the viral videos or even the damage to her career. She had lost the respect of her family and the trust of her community through her refusal to accept that sometimes, as a visitor in someone else's country, you need to follow their rules rather than demanding that they accommodate your preferences. The lesson that Margaret Thompson learned, far too late, was that true sophistication and worldliness come not from demanding special treatment, but from showing respect for other cultures and traditions. Her dream of being seen as an experienced and cultured traveler had been destroyed by her own entitled behavior, and she would spend years trying to rebuild what she had lost in those few minutes outside Buckingham Palace. Margaret's story serves as a reminder that in our interconnected world, where every public moment can be recorded and shared globally, our behavior has consequences that extend far beyond what we might have imagined. Her encounter with the Queen's Guard became a viral sensation not because of any injustice done to her, but because her behavior represented everything that people around the world find frustrating about entitled tourist behavior. In the end, Margaret Thompson got exactly what she had always demanded. She became the center of attention, the person everyone was talking about. But, as she learned too late, not all attention is the kind you want, and some mistakes follow you far longer than you ever imagined they would.